Invincible is a comic book series written by Robert Kirkman, along with artists Cory Walker and Ryan Ottley. And it was published by Image Comics and later on in conjunction with Kirkman's Skybound Comics imprint. It's about a young half human, half Viltrumite, sort of, named Mark Grayson, who takes upon himself the mantle of the superhero Invincible and becomes the defender of Earth and beyond. In this, we see an incredible series about Mark as he grows, lives, loves, and manages different aspects of his life, relationships, and heritage. It's one of the greatest comic book series ever written. The comic has recently been adapted into a similarly excellent TV series on Amazon Prime, which has greatly increased its popularity. And, if reports are to be believed, there's also a live action film still in the works. Part of what makes Invincible so good is how it's really two series at once. Sometimes it's simply an excellent superhero story in the classic sense about a pure hearted hero who defeats bad guys and has incredible fight scenes. But other times, it's a subversive take on that same pure hero archetype, which questions authority and doesn't sugarcoat the hyperviolence that superpowered characters would cause in a world among normal humans. Like many superhero series, Invincible has a much wider universe outside of its main characters. Many of these characters plays large parts within the series itself, while others are frankly underdeveloped. That's not an indictment of Invincible per se. It's simply of a reality of the comic book medium and how these universes are often told and how these characters are addressed. To combat this, Invincible does what most series do, and it has several spin off series. Some are miniseries that are meant to expand on the main cast, others are to fill out the universe and create more characters, kind of make this world feel bigger and more lived in. And others give characters that aren't really main characters within the series more screen time and development. In this video, I wanted to talk about many of those series. Obviously, I mean, I'm sure there's some obscure ones that I missed, but I feel like I've covered all the major ones here. We know that one of these spin-offs has already been adapted into a special for the TV show in the Adam Eve special, and aspects of others have been weaved into the narrative of the show as well. And I know it's possible that some of these other series might be in their own limited series or might be once again weaved into the main series as a whole. Because as we know, platforms like Image Comics and Amazon love to milk their successful IPs, and Invincible is really hot right now. But I'm sure that many non comic book readers might be interested in hearing about what else is out there to experience within this Invincible universe. It's also perfect timing because in the most recent episode of Invincible, which at the time of recording is season 3, episode 5, we finally got to see other members of the villainous group called the Order, which is kind of like, the villainous version of the Guardians of the Globe. And it just so happens that many of the members of the Order appear in a number of these miniseries. So if any of these characters look interesting to you and you'd like to learn more about them, you might want to check out some of these spin-offs. And so in this video, I want to do a brief overview of these series while avoiding spoilers, so that if anyone's interested, they can still check out these series themselves. That's in contrast to my first video on this channel and most of my planned content, which is honestly going to focus more on deep dives. And if there's an appetite for it, maybe in the future I could do a deep dive in Invincible or some of the spin-off series. But for now, I just wanted to give people a kind of appetizer to see like if something piques their interest and if they might want to check out any of these series for themselves. And even though I'm going to do my best to avoid spoilers, that's obviously not possible to do completely. I won't be spoiling any major plot points, but I'm still going to give a blanket spoiler warning for Invincible and for any of the series that I will be covering in this video. There are a few series in particular that will spoil Invincible, and I'll try to avoid those details. But this is just a blanket warning in case, something I say might spoil something for you in the future. So I'm going to avoid them, but still watch this at your own risk. As for the order that I'm going to cover these series in, I'm not really doing anything specific. It's just an order that kind of makes sense to me. I'm not going to be covering them in chronological or publication order. And so the first spinoff that I wanted to mention is the Adam Eve miniseries, which is called Invincible Presents Adam Eve. So this is a comic miniseries that shows us the backstory of Samantha Eve Wilkins, otherwise known as the superhero Adam Eve. I won't be going over this one because it's already been adapted into the Adam Eve TV special, which released in between seasons 1 and 2. And so if you're a fan of the Invincible TV show, you've already watched this adaptation. Obviously, nothing's ever one-to-one, but the miniseries and the special are similar enough to where I don't think it's necessary to cover them here. And I want to move on to series that people might not be familiar with. It is excellent, though. It's probably the best of the Invincible spin-offs, and if you're checking out the comic series, it's definitely a must-read. But you've seen the special, so you already know how good it is. But what some people may not know is that there is a follow-up to this, which is called Invincible Presents Adam, Eve, and Rex Splode. And as you probably gathered from the title, this series shows us the origin of Rex Splode and how he and Eve met. Some of this info was hinted at in the season 3 conversation between Rex and Shrinking Ray, but we get to see how Rex gained his powers and how bad his family life was before he was sold to the government by his parents. Ultimately, Rex starts to question the morality of some of the actions he's ordered to take, and he ends up fleeing and meeting Eve. We see in the early part of their friendship and their eventual romantic relationship. This series is fairly brisk, and a lot happens in a mere 3 issues. And while it's not as good as the Adam Eve miniseries, it's still definitely worth a read and excellent in its own right. While I know most people have probably already come around on Rex, this will help anybody with any lingering doubts about him. We see why he keeps people at arm's length due to past bad experiences with people who he thought he could trust and were supposed to care about him, and why he and Eve got so close so fast. If you're aching for more info on Rex and don't want to wait to see what gets adapted into the TV series, if anything, check this one out and you won't be disappointed. The next spinoff that I wanted to mention isn't technically a spinoff, but 2 of the characters do make a brief appearance in the Invincible comic series, although their appearance was already adapted with different characters in the Invincible show, so it's unlikely they'll be appearing in that. But I decided to include it anyway, especially since this is some of the earliest stuff that Kirkman wrote for Image Comics, and we see a lot of the DNA of what he's going to do later on appear in this series. And in particular, one of these other miniseries definitely takes a lot of cues from it. So in this section, I will talk about the Image Comics character named SuperPatriot. SuperPatriot is a superhero who was created by Eric Larson of Savage Dragon fame. He is an ally of Dragon, and he first appeared in that series, but would eventually have his own adventures as well. One of the first things Robert Kirkman did for Image Comics was write a miniseries about SuperPatriot with the eventual first artist and co-creator of Invincible, Cory Walker, in 2002, and it was called America's Fighting Force. He would later write a second miniseries from 2004 to 2007 with the eventual Tech Jacket artist EJ Sue called War on Terror. And so, like I said, these aren't technically Invincible spinoffs, but SuperPatriot and his wife Claire Bono do have a brief interaction with Debbie Grayson in Invincible and in SuperPatriot War on Terror, where Debbie meets with Claire, who works for Funkatron Publishing, which is the company that published Nolan's books, to inform her that Nolan's books are selling well since his death and that she'll receive his royalty money. We briefly see Patriot in this as well. Debbie and Claire form a friendship over being married to superheroes and hang out a few times. Obviously, with conflicting rights, Amazon had to make some changes to the cast, and Debbie's conversation with Claire is instead with Olga, the partner of Red Rush. Despite this, there's a clear influence of SuperPatriot on Brit, at least to my eye, which is a Robert Kirkman character that I will talk about in this video as well, actually in the next chapter. So I figured it was worth mentioning. And we also see a lot of Invincible's DNA in specifically the first miniseries. So if you don't really care enough about this character, since it's so tangentially related anyway, feel free to skip to the next chapter. Also, I'm not going to be covering any SuperPatriot stuff outside of the miniseries, but luckily they're largely self-contained, and any outside information that's necessary is given within the miniseries themselves. So SuperPatriot is a Captain America type hero. He was a soldier in World War II, and he was captured and experimented on by the Nazis, probably due to his blonde hair and blue eyes. And these experiments are what gave him powers, such as enhanced strength and such. He also has these cool robotic limbs that can change form and which he can use as weapons, to travel more quickly and even capture villains. Unlike Captain America, though, we do see him age over time. He's not a man out of time. He's actually an old man. And once he came back from the war, his viewpoint started to shift as he saw that things weren't as black and white as they were back then. He meets and starts dating a beautiful young woman named Claire Bono, but it's okay, everyone. She asked him out, and he admits that it's bad. But in all seriousness, they do have a good dynamic together. We get glimpses of his normal life and routines, as well as his battles with villainous Nazis like Baron Blitzkrieg, and no joke, Hitler's brain, which is often connected to a large gorilla body, and sometimes it's just a sentient brain with little arms and legs. He also deals with family drama connected with his recent discovery of his adult children, liberty, and justice. In the second miniseries, he's dealing with the emotional and legal fallout from a tragedy and also the weight of starting a new family with his now wife, Claire. Patriot's a super easy hero to like. He's almost good to a fault in some ways, other than with age gaps, obviously. But he's that classic superhero, and he gives that feeling of hope amid tragedy. But this is Image Comics, so not everything is sunshine and rainbows, and Patriot does make mistakes. But there are always things that are understandable. This is a fairly dark world, but it never feels too heavy due to the silliness and classic superhero feel. You can definitely see the DNA of early Invincible here. And I definitely think that this series is worth a read if you're a fan of that series, or if you're just interested in checking out more of Image Comics' library. Like I said, there isn't much Invincible lore here because Patriot really is an Eric Larson character. But seeing some of Kirkman's early work with Walker and Sue is a lot of fun, and I would highly recommend this. They are both fairly brisk reads, so they don't overstay their welcomes. And it kind of touches on that old soldier trope and not feeling like he has a place in the world anymore and question if all the actions he took were morally correct. And then at the end of the day, it's just good old Nazi punching fun. Even if you're a newcomer to Savage Dragon or Super Patriot, these series are self-contained enough to where you can read them without any issues. I cannot recommend them enough. The next series I'm going to cover, at least to me, seems to take some cues from Super Patriot, in that it's about an old soldier who's still doing the superhero thing and is in a relationship with a beautiful young blonde woman. But unlike Eric Larson's more PG 13 Savage Dragon universe, we are firmly into Kirkman's violent and sometimes raunchy R rated universe. This series that I'm referring to is, of course, Brit. Brit was originally a series of 3 one shots written by Robert Kirkman with artist Tony Moore. It would later become a short 12-issue series where Bruce Brown would replace Kirkman as the writer, and artists Cliff Rathburn and Nate Belgard take over for Tony Moore. Part of why I would recommend reading this series in particular, perhaps more than anything except the Rex Splode series, is that Brit is almost certainly going to appear in the Invincible show at some point. And also, if you're a fan of Donald Ferguson, this is actually the series where we learn his backstories and not the Invincible main series, unlike in the TV show. We learn about how his condition of dying over and over affects his relationship with his wife and son as well. But getting into the character at hand, Brit, or Brittany, is a hero whose powers are invulnerability and decreased aging. His power set leads to some very interesting fight scenes where a lot of the time his tactic is just to get beaten to hell until his opponent wears himself out or, in some cases, injures himself. Without getting too much into spoilers, we at one point see him fight Invincible, and it's fun because they can't really hurt each other since Brit is invulnerable, but he's not strong enough to do any damage to Invincible. And so Brit's basically just getting ragdolled, but neither one of them are taking damage. And I know that hearing about a guy just taking beatings until his opponents can't fight doesn't necessarily sound like fun, but this series knows how to keep things interesting, and that's not his exclusive tactic in fighting either. So in the first miniseries, which is the 3 one-shots, we get the raunchiness that I was talking about because Brit is actually the manager of a strip club, which is where he meets his girlfriend and eventual wife, Jessica, as she is one of the strippers there. I know, like Super Patriot, this is going to gross some people out, which I don't blame anyone for. I'm not endorsing huge age gap relationships like this, but it does create a fun dynamic between Brit and Jessica's dad in some scenes, where it sometimes comes off with a father-son dynamic with Brit as the father. We also get to meet some other characters, like the aforementioned Donald, and then also Brit's sister, also Brittany, but spelled differently, who has similar powers to him, except they're a little different. She's stronger than him, but also less durable, and she works for the DEA. Also, funny story. In the trade paperback, Brown admits that she was supposed to be old like Brit, but they intentionally aged her down so that they could market the series off her sex appeal. They make a joke about it, but they admit that they knew what they were doing. And then we also get the third morally dubious black government agent, Slitter. I'm not sure why this series felt the need to make all of these guys black. I mean, what are they trying to say here? Due to Brit's power set, this is probably the most unique of the spinoffs. It touches on a lot of similar ground to Super Patriot, but also plays more on how the government views superheroes as tools. Like I said, Super Patriot in the end is a more hopeful, upbeat series. And here we see that when those tools are no longer useful, what happens to them? Which, if you're a fan of Invincible, you probably don't find that surprising. It has creative fight scenes, and it fills out the story for characters such as Donald. And as stated, Brit eventually joins into the greater Invincible story as well. So this series, along with Adam Eve and Rexplode, are must reads for any Invincible fans. It's certainly very comic booky, perhaps more so than any of the other series that I'm going to cover in this video. And so, depending on your mileage, that may be a good or bad thing. And I'm sure enough of Brit's story will be covered in Invincible to get the gist of who he is, but I still doubt that the show will cover this whole story, which is a fun ride and worth a read in and of itself. The next three series that I'm going to cover together because I kind of almost view them as a set. The main reason being that they share characters, and except for the first series, they're tonally very similar as well. The second two are really, for lack of a better term, just the same series. The first one, there's a little bit of variance, but I still think I'm going to cover them together. So these series are called Capes, Guarding the Globe, and Invincible Universe. First, we will cover Capes. Capes was first released in 2003, the same year as Invincible. Robert Kirkman came up with this idea in high school. It began life as a superhero comic and then was changed into a pro wrestling comic, and ultimately Kirkman ended up changing it back into a superhero comic. And Kirkman wrote this series with artist Mark Englertz. With this series in particular, there are several caveats that I feel I should list for anyone who might be interested in reading it. First, it is out and out a comedy series. This might be jarring for Invincible TV show fans, as while the show has its light moments, it's definitely toned down a lot of the comedic elements within the comic. And this isn't like reading Invincible or the other spin-offs coming from the TV show, where obviously there are some tonal differences, but it's still, there's a lot more similarities than differences. This is jumping straight into the deep end with a comedy series, which, might not be what you're looking for. In conjunction with that, it has a much more cartoony and almost Archie Comics art style, which again might not be everyone's favorite. It is certainly not meant to be taken seriously. The next caveat is that this series only lasted 3 issues. It was later brought back with a few backup stories for Invincible issues, which ended up being the length of another 3 issues, meaning that the series in a whole is only 6 issues in length. And I know that most of these series are pretty short, but this one is on another level. I mean, technically, the Adam Eve and Rexplode series are shorter, but they were meant to be short. They were just covering a certain backstory. The main issue with these being so short is that in the first 3 issues, they're set up for a lot of drop plot lines. So if you see any interesting idea, just know that there's a good chance that it will never come to fruition. But moving on and covering the series itself, Capes is about a group of superheroes who work for a private superhero company called Capes Inc. Unlike the superheroes in the main Invincible universe, these heroes have a more 9 to 5 job. They clock in and out, they have separate day and night shifts, water cooler conversations, and dinner with other employees. They even get paid if they're attacked or fight a villain when they're not on the clock. And they have partners and do patrols almost like police officers. And there is a huge roster of heroes. Most of them don't really ever get any development, though. The company's CEO, Big Brain, is one. And then there are also older guys who are the Meteor Twins who worked with Big Brain in their younger days. We also have veteran members such as Captain Capitalism, yes, really, and Captain Cosmic, yeah, so 2 CCs. And then we also have 3 characters who are really the main characters of this series, who are Bolt, Kid Thor, and Knockout. For the most part, you see your basic superheroes. Bolt has super strength, Kid Thor has the powers of Thor, and Knockout has equipment, specifically her boxing gloves, that are her source of power. We also have villains such as Chronodile, Vault, and Dot Cancer. Again, yes, really. This was the early 2000s humor. The first part of the series, which is the 3 issues, is really more focused on the comedy and almost slice of life type elements of the series. But it does eventually go into more superhero action type stuff that you'd probably be more used to. It even has a pretty good twist in this first the series as well, which I'm obviously not going to spoil here. I enjoyed it, but I definitely think this is the most skippable of the spin-offs. If you enjoy lighter fare, it might still be worth a look for you. And now the second and third parts in this kind of 3-part series that I talked about, of this unofficial 3-part series that I talked about, are called Guarding the Globe and Invincible Universe. Guarding the Globe is made up of 2 volumes, each having 6 issues, and then Invincible Universe likewise also has 12 issues. Kirkman co wrote Volume 1 of Guarding the Globe with artists such as Benito Cirino and Ransom Getty and Chris Anka. Volume 2 of Guarding the Globe and Invincible Universe is taken over by writers Phil Hester and then artist Todd Knock. I'll put it up on screen. And so I'm covering these 2 series together as, in all honesty, they're really the same series. They have the same cast of characters, and it's all about the same types of storylines as well. And so in these series, we see the return of familiar characters such as Brit and Bulletproof, who I cannot show to avoid spoilers for the main Invincible series, and Black Samson. But more particularly, we get a new cast of characters. So basically, the inciting incident for this series is that Cecil decides the Guardians of the Globe need to expand, and that they should actually be a global organization that, guards the globe, but not just the United States. And so they begin recruiting and adding more members to the team. Some of the notable ones being Yeti from Nepal, Kaboomerang from Australia, El Chupacabra from Mexico, Outrun from South Africa, Cast Iron from, at the time, Yugoslavia, Pegasus from Russia, Le Bruiser from France, Japan Droid from Japan, obviously, Best Tiger from China, and we see the returns of Kid Thor, who now we know is from Canada, and Knockout, who is from the US. And in these series, we also get to learn more and see more of the members of the Legion of Doom to the Guardian of the Globe's Justice League, the Order. And many of the characters that we saw in the Invincible scene from Season 3, Episode 5 appear in these series. In particular, this woman here, who's named Embrace. And we see how evil she is as she does something that is so vile that it honestly rivals Anissa's action that happens later in the series as well. It's the typical team stuff. We see growing pains of a new team, and we get to learn about some of the personal issues that a lot of these characters have. There's also a tragedy that threatens to split the team up, and in particular causes one member to become ostracized and has to really earn back everybody's respect and trust. Obviously, this is a big cast, but the series does do a good job of introducing the characters and giving them at least some character arcs. And the pre-existing characters are woven in pretty well as well. There definitely is more focus on the newer characters, along with Kid Thor and Knockout. And speaking of Kid Thor, we get some new interesting lore about him as well. In total, these 24 issues are worth a read. They expand on the Invincible universe, and we get to see Invincible more in an international sense as opposed to, just really the Baltimore and more broadly the United States area. And if you're a fan of the Invincible comics, you know that it eventually starts going into more cosmic adventures. And so it's fun to still see some more grounded and less serialized stories, which can serve as a good pace breaker for the later series. The next 2 series are the 2 longest series, and they're also the 2 most unique as well. They, in a really real sense, are standalone stories that just happen to take place in the same universe. You can make that argument for Brit, but Brit's kind of so woven into the Invincible lore at this point that I kind of see it more as just a true spinoff. Likewise, both these characters do cross over with Invincible, but their stories are still their own stories and they're mostly self contained. These 2 series are called Tech Jacket and The Astounding Wolf-Man. Starting first with Tech Jacket. The interesting thing about Tech Jacket is that it actually debuted a few months before Invincible did. And according to Robert Kirkman, its first issue outsold Invincible's first issue. But whereas Invincible would recover and eventually become a huge hit, Tech Jacket really never got its footing, and its initial run was only 6 issues. Kirkman expressed some regret in canceling it, as his 2 most successful series, being Invincible and The Walking Dead, both initially struggled as well, but eventually were able to turn around and become huge hits. But Tech Jacket ultimately was revived for a small run of a total of 23 issues. Robert Kirkman wrote the first 6 issues alone, and he wrote the next 2 with another writer named Aubrey Sitterson. And these first 8 issues were all drawn by the artist E.J. Sue, who we originally talked about in the SuperPatriot section. After that, writer Joe Kittinge and artist Kerry Randolph took over. Tech Jacket is about a young man named Zach Thompson. He's a normal teenager who helps his dad Ed at his hardware shop. In the first issue, we really get to see Zach and we get to see how powerless he is in the world that he inhabits. The girl he likes ditches him for a guy with a car. His dad borrowed money from gangsters to keep his hardware shop afloat, and now he can't pay, and so they're coming and beating him up and injuring him. But Zach's world is about to change as he comes into contact with a race of aliens named the Geldarians, and he's given a super suit by one of them called the Tech Jacket. So these Tech Jackets permanently attach to your body, and they give you enhanced strength, speed, and they can turn into and create various weapons as well. The issue is that the Geldarians have strict laws that only they can use these Tech Jackets. So a group of them come to Earth and bring Zack back to Geldaria to stand trial. We learn that the Geldarians are at war with a group of aliens called the Kresh, and have been for centuries. And the Kresh have recently broken the stalemate and have taken an advantage in the war, putting the Geldarians on the back foot. And so after Zack shows how useful he can be, they decide to forgive him and actually have him help them in their war. And so we learned that the purpose of the Tech Jackets was because the Geldarians have such advanced technology that their bodies began to become unused, and so they withered and became small and weak. To combat this, they created the Tech Jackets, which are attached to their bodies at birth and cannot be removed. But Zack, being human, is not nearly as frail as the Geldarians, so he has become immensely powerful. And we'll actually see through some of the interactions that he's arguably stronger than Mark at a certain point in the series. And so that's the reason why the Geldarians had this law, as they knew that someone else besides them getting a Tech Jacket could be disastrous. The Geldarians label Zack a savior and enlist him to help in their war effort. And they train him how to use the Tech Jacket and give him physical training as well, as the more physically strong he is, the stronger the suit gets. And so this series mostly revolves around his interactions with the Geldarians. And so we see a lot of big space battles and large-scale conflicts, all of which were a lot of fun. The Geldarians also give Zack a monitoring station in space where his dad becomes his guy in the chair and helps him kind of monitor the Earth and see where he's needed. Zack also ends up starting a relationship with the Princess of Geldaria, Lynn, and they end up having relationship issues for honestly what is a very understandable reason. And we get to see somewhat of the differences between humans and Geldarians because the way that they decide to deal with this is different, and it causes more conflict between the two as time goes on. I do think that often in this series things move a bit too fast, but it's just kind of the hand that this series was dealt. It's still excellent, and besides Invincible and one other, it's probably my favorite of these. Like I said, there is one more spinoff that I do like just a touch more, but I highly recommend this one for Invincible fans, especially because this is probably the one that's going to be the most similar to Invincible for you. Obviously, it does focus more on that lighter superhero fare and doesn't bring into much of the heaviness that Invincible has, but it's still there. And so I feel like if an Invincible fan would like any of the spin-offs, it would probably be this one. Next, I would like to cover the Astounding Wolf-Man, which is, for me, my favorite of all these spin-offs. So this series was written by Robert Kirkman, and the art was done by Jason Howard. Jason Howard actually, for the first 10 issues, did the pencils, inks, and coloring. And he did the pencils for every single issue, and the inks for every one except issue 11, where Cliff Rathburn took over for that issue. But starting with issue 11, he gave over duties of the colors to a duo of FCO and Ivan Placencia, who did the colors for the rest of the run, with the exception of a few pages in the final issue, which Howard did as well. This series centers around a father and husband named Gary Hampton. Gary is a self-made billionaire who is at risk of losing his company. He and his wife, Rebecca, and his daughter, Chloe, are on vacation in Montana when Gary is mauled by what his family thinks is a bear, and he loses most of his skin and falls into a coma. Once he comes out of the coma, we learn that Gary was not mauled by a bear, but instead a werewolf. Not only that, but his progenitor is what is called an elder werewolf, which are the first and most powerful of the werewolves, making Gary what is called among werewolves an elder brood, meaning that he has a pure form of the curse. A mysterious man named Zechariah, who reveals himself to be a vampire, offers to train Gary and help him gain control of his powers. Gary soon does gain control of his transformation, and he transforms into the wolf every night. When he transforms, he has increased strength, stamina, and agility, enhanced senses, the typical werewolf Wolverine type stuff. But also, he no longer has to sleep. and his transformation heals any wounds that he sustained while in the other form, with some exceptions that we'll address later on. Well, actually, I won't address because they're spoilers, but if you read the series, you'll see. We also later learn that he can actively heal while in his wolf form, but if the wound is very severe, this will drain all of his energy and he'll immediately pass out once he returns to human form. And so this isn't something you could do in the middle of a battle. It's something that you have to do once you're safe. The main drawback of his transformation is that once a month under the full moon, he goes into what is called a full moon frenzy, where he loses control of himself and just becomes a wild animal again. Given that Gary is losing his company, where he used to do a lot of good, like setting up charities, building hospitals, etc., he decides to become a superhero so that he can still help people. Obviously, though, people are afraid of the big scary werewolf, but he eventually gets a suit from Art, which helps make him less intimidating. He has run ins with characters such as Invincible, Cecil, and more particularly, a group of heroes called the Actioneers. In fact, one of the heroes, Code Blue, has their own origin story shown in the last 4 issues in a backup story. But it's so short that I'm not going to go into any of the details because I feel like anything would be spoilers. Just if you read this series, it's in there in those last 4 issues. And that's kind of one of the quirks of this series is that I can't really discuss a lot of the story plots because there's a big spoiler that occurs very early on in the series. But suffice it to say that this series is really well written, and it even has an emotionality that's not always present in a lot of these other series. I do wish that there were more horror elements as a horror fan. It's not devoid of them, it's just I was hoping for more because the back end really is just a superhero story, just he happens to be a werewolf. And I know that Kirkman could have added in more stuff because I mean Kirkman's biggest series of all time is a horror series. But this series is still excellent. And despite it only being 25 issues, it really does feel like a full story. I think it has some of the best uses of violence of any of these series, even sometimes rivaling Invincible. Obviously, series like Brit and stuff are hyper violent as well, but that series is a lot more goofy, intentionally goofy, but goofy nonetheless. Whereas here, the violence feels a lot more visceral and intense. Likewise, there are emotions at play such as sadness, anger, revenge, forgiveness, which all give this series a weight that I think is absent in most of the other spin offs. I know I said Adam Eve was the best, but I mean, I really think there is a strong case for the Astounding Wolf-Man to be the best of the spin offs, which really shouldn't be a surprise because it's the only one that Kirkman wrote the entire run of. Kirkman's a great writer, what can you say? But there is the potential caveat in that this series is so dissimilar from Invincible that if you were looking for something with a similar vibe, this won't scratch that itch for you. But if you are a Walking Dead fan who is interested in the Invincible mythos, this series might be a good entry point for you because in a lot of ways it could serve as a bridge between the two series. If you want to experience a short yet excellent story, definitely check this one out. The final spinoff that I'm going to talk about, I don't really have much to say about. It's called The Pact Volume 2. And for anyone concerned about The Pact Volume 1, don't be, as it has no relation to this other than the fact that both are superhero team up series published through Image Comics. The Pact sees Invincible form a superhero team with 3 other teen superheroes from Image Comics: Firebreather, Shadowhawk, and Zephyr. It is a 4-part series of one-shots starring these 4 characters. The creators of each character each write one of these issues, with Robert Kirkman writing issue 4 of 4. Like I said, they're all small one-off stories, so unless you're a fan of the other characters, you can probably skip these. I mean, they're fun in their own way, but they don't really add much to the Invincible mythos, which is what we're here for. And so, those are the Invincible spinoffs, or at least the main ones. I'm sure I missed some obscure ones that, if anyone's watching this, people in the comments can let me know about. But those are the ones that I wanted to cover in this video. If you're an Invincible fan, particularly a fan of the show as opposed to the comic, because if you're a fan of the comic, you've probably already read these. But I think that most of these are, for the most part, worth checking out. Like I said, I do have a few hesitations with a few of these series. Adam Eve's already been adapted into the show, so unless you're one of those completionist types, you probably won't feel the need to revisit it. I mean, it is excellent, but the version of the TV show is excellent as well. So I'm not sure if just checking out the comic in and of itself necessarily gives you much that isn't available in the TV show. The Pact is really only worth reading if you're a fan of the other characters or if you're interested in learning more about them and checking them out. I've heard good things about the Shadowhawk series. I don't really know much about the other ones. Capes is a comedy series that doesn't resolve most of its plot points. The two SuperPatriot miniseries are excellent, but they really just serve for you to understand a brief cameo of an Invincible. But it is fun to see Kirkman's early work. And while I believe the Astounding Wolf-Man to be arguably the best of these spin-offs, it doesn't share a lot in common with the Invincible main series, so it may not appeal to Invincible fans per se. Everything else, though, is an easy recommendation, and I think it will only enhance your enjoyment of the series. Most are available digitally and physically. I believe Robert Kirkman's issue of the Pact is available in one of the Invincible trade paperbacks, but I didn't really have time to go through every single one to check. But again, if it isn't, like I said, you're not missing too much. But read these, and I think if you're an Invincible fan, you'll enjoy them. Obviously, there's a chance that certain elements of them might be woven into the Invincible as a whole, but I don't think all of them will be. And in particular, I really think that Astounding Wolfman and Tech Jacket are worth the read in and of themselves. Hey, so I just want to do a quick outro and thank anybody who happened upon this video and decided to watch it. This is my second ever YouTube video, and I still have a lot to learn. I know that maybe I didn't explain a lot of these series super well, but I was doing my best to avoid spoilers so that you could check them out for yourselves. As for some of my other content, if you're interested in Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, I'm doing a deep dive into that franchise and reviewing every single iteration of the series. And the first of those videos is already up on my channel, which covers the first part of the original Ninja Turtles comics. I plan on doing a deep dive review of every version and then in the end ranking them from best to worst. Basically, what I'm doing for content for now is I'll be alternating between releasing those deep dive TMNT videos and shorter videos like this. I mean, shorter for me. And my plan is tentatively to release every 2 weeks, but as I'm still learning these whole processes, I'm not going to hard commit to that. But just know that the video release schedule is going to be one TMNT video and one video about a different topic that I find interesting, and so on until I've gotten through every version of TMNT. So if you ever see any video you might like, please click on it and give it a watch. Thank you. And this is Chucklehead Renaissance once again fading away into the night.